I make fun for a living. Well, my name is Louis Castle. I'm the Vice President of Creative Development for Electronic Arts Los Angeles, and I'm the co-founder of Westwood Studios, which created Command & Conquer. I didn't think that I'd ever be into video games as a business, but got into architecture, saw some CAD/CAM stuff, decided I had to learn computers, and once I learned more about them, I figured out that that was a pretty good place for me to mix art and technology. And having a little bit of both in my background, that seemed like the right place to go. Gaming was the place to be if you wanted to be pushing graphics. And this is a time, this goes way back before there were even graphics tools to do any graphics. We were typing in code just to get a couple of pixels on the screen. Well, Westwood started because a very good friend of mine, Brett Sperry, he needed a printout. And I worked at a computer store, I had a printer. So he came over one afternoon, we sat in my office, my actually converted garage, which also doubles as my bedroom, and we sat down and talked about all sorts of different opportunities we might have in the future. We literally started with no money, right out of my garage. We even had an employee working out of this back converted garage before we actually got our first offices. So it started from very humble beginnings. The reason we called the company Westwood Studios was we used to go down to Southern California and hang out by Westwood, where UCLA is, and we really liked the culture down there. When we started Westwood, I was 20 and Brett was 21, so very young. And at that time, it wasn't just the two of us. We started bringing in our friends and such, and pretty much everybody that we talked to really wanted to make these games. They wanted to have a part in the products. But by and large, you couldn't find a place in Vegas anyways that was really willing to put them first. Everybody was looking to, like I said, try to take them and exploit them to some extent, to use their time and energies and just try to grind a game out of them, versus really giving everybody a chance to grow and become true craftsmen. And that allowed a company like ours, which really focused on fine arts and music and the things that we would call now production values, we really saw those as being very important to games. And at the time, that, believe it or not, was pretty revolutionary thinking. Most people really focused on, didn't matter what the game looked like as long as it had the sort of core mechanics to make it fun. We would hire people with absolutely no computer experience at all. For a while, I remember we were running an ad in the paper asking for any artist who had 10 years of illustration and painting experience, professional experience, as a minimum. And there really weren't people you were going to find that could do that and had computer graphics experience. And I remember hiring guys like Gary Freeman, a fantastic artist, and Rick Parks and a few others that had very, very little or none at all, no experience at all as computer operators. And they would always ask me, they'd say, well, you know, why are you talking to me? I don't know anything about computers. Why would you want to hire an artist like me? And my answer is always the same. It's, you know, you've spent a lifetime or many, many years, decades even, learning to paint, learning to draw, learning to see the world. And I can't teach you that. But I can teach you how to use a computer. That's pretty easy, comparatively. I think that's why we were successful, because we really were committed and continue to be committed years and years later to the careers of the people that had put all the time into the products. The first game we worked on was a game called Temple of Apshai Trilogy. At that point, we were trying to make this game for the Macintosh, and that was a new system at the time. And I didn't even really know how to program a Macintosh at the time. So they thumped this big 1,700-page volume of Inside Mac and went through it cover to cover many times and learned how to program the machine at the same time that we were doing the project. It was quite successful. We got the game done very quickly. We got it done under budget. And so the guys at Epyx said, hey, that seems like a pretty good deal. Why don't we do a couple more? I think the RTS game came about as a product of Westwood's desire as a team to build real-time games. The reason I say that, we had done a game that was quite popular called Eye of the Beholder, which was a Dungeons and Dragons game. And it was all in real time. And we loved strategy games. But the thing that always struck us about strategy games in general was they were a little on the dry side. So what was really exciting and what seemed to really get everybody's fires going was, what if you had to do the strategy game where you're moving units around, you're building units, you're deciding how you're going to spend your resources, but at the same time, you weren't able to have the luxury of waiting until your opponent moved. You had to do it all in real time, right there on the spot. And by the way, somebody else is trying to beat you at the same time. So all of this stuff happening at once and really feeling like you're combating against somebody was what really drove the genre. It really makes real-time strategy games so much different than a typical strategy game. Well, the very first real-time strategy game that we made, and frankly probably the very first game anybody would recognize as a real-time strategy game, was called Dune 2. We shipped this product, it did very well, And we decided to do our own original property around the concepts, the core compulsions which made this strategy game so much fun.
Sources indicate that GDI terrorists were convinced that this simple hamlet was involved in the manufacture and shipping of Tiberium. When will this madness end? Only when General Shepard and his vision of one world order is stopped.
Cut. Excellent. Now, do it again in French and German. I want 300 copies made and sent to every TV station in Europe. We have the satellite for another 10 minutes. Is that camera still running?
If we want to live in a different world.
With Command and Conquer, what we did was we took this idea of this real-time strategy, the pressure of having to make these strategic decisions, and we wanted to put it into a context which was really accessible to that day. But the story of CNC really came about the conflict between good and evil, and to cast that evil character at the time, we really wanted to reach into what was at the heart of most people's fears. And at the time, we weren't afraid of the Soviets or anything else. We were very much afraid of, the world was afraid of terrorism. And Brett and Edie and Joe came up with this great story idea of, why don't we take this really charismatic, megalomaniacal guy who would gather together a bunch of terrorists and create an organization and take on the world. And of course, that's what CNC is all about, this terrorist organization called the Brotherhood of Nod. And of course, if something existed like that, the world would have to react. And so all the Western nations got together and created this GDI, Global Defense Initiative, to combat Kane and the Brotherhood of Nod. This was back in 1995, many years before we have ourselves in our current geopolitical situation. So it was a bit of fortune telling, as it were, and I think that's what made it resonate with people, and that's what really made Command and Conquer mean something to people, because it felt like it could happen any day, and of course it did. In the creation of the original Command and Conquer, there was a lot of hard days, I guess. You know, there was a couple of years worth of work that went into that product.
The boys at R&D have completed preliminary testing on the ion cannon.
And so everybody in the company, even the people not working on the product, had a really clear sense that this was something different and something special. So we were inspired, I think, in ways that that you can only be inspired of by just a passion and a love of the business, to really stretch, to really push ourselves. I remember talking to Brett one time about the movies, and he said, well, they have to be full screen, and they have to be full color, and they have to play off a CD-ROM with audio. But you can't do that. It's like, well, we'll just have to figure out how, because that's what it has to be. Clearly, we were very, very cutting edge. One of the very first companies to put out what looked like movies for your computer.
I need you and Morelli to take a couple of these babies up and put them through the mill.
But at the same time, the things we were doing in real-time strategy were quite difficult. Hundreds and hundreds of units all having to figure out where they're going to go on the map all at once. Back in those days, the CPU and the computing power overall just wasn't there. So those were really hard problems to solve. So between being this armchair general that commanded all these troops in real time against other generals, and this incredible storyline that really felt like it was coming off the front pages of the paper, that's what really solidified CNC as a story to be timeless.
Stand by, I'll link us up.
Condition critical. Know why Nod had this beach bottled up? They're protecting the big Tiberium refinery that intelligence somehow missed. We need backup now.
There are now more than 200 areas of the Earth affected by Tiberium deposits.
And the concept of Tiberium was the need to have some sort of central resource that everybody was fighting over. There had to be this discontinuous event that would suddenly charge up the world and make all this stuff come to a head.
Dr. Mobius, tell our viewers just what Tiberium really is.
It had to be something that was really unusual, something that would really trigger these world events. And that stuff starts to change the way the planet works. It leaches all the minerals out of the soil and surrounding area and turns into things that you can easily harvest: gold, platinum, nickel, and things like that. So it turns out that there's this gift from heaven, which on the one hand allows you to have a lot of quick profits, but on the other hand it turns out to be quite toxic. And that's the nice dichotomy of Command and Conquer. We have this really sort of heroic figure who turns out to be a villain. We have these people who claim to be trying to do the right things, which kind of feeling a little on the military side, and this never really feeling like anybody's completely right or completely wrong. that coupled with this gift from space, as it were, again, really resonated with people as something that's very unusual. And Tiberium really figures heavily into the world as this catalyst for all these conflicts. And that was why Tiberium was created, was simply to have something to fight over.
The possibilities of Tiberium are limitless.
Your efforts have landed us here, my faithful friend. The temple is complete, and we are about to embark upon our greatest exploit.
When Command & Conquer 1 was shipped, we were only about 60 people, and we were working on 3 projects. So we were doing an awful lot of stuff with very few people. We had put about 3 years of work into that project, and probably about 60 man-years, which was just an enormous amount of effort. And at the time, a lot of people didn't think that the game had a lot of possibilities. We had original forecasts in tens of thousands of units, like 60,000 units, versus the 2+ million that we sold. So it was quite a leap of faith to get that product out. Now, once we actually showed it to the public, once we saw the people's eyes light up, once we saw them playing, I think everybody kind of got a hold of the idea that this is something really different, something special, something big.